They called the mothers fallen. They called the children shame. But in the stone corridors of Tuam, something darker learned their names. The air in Tuam was heavy, thick as peat smoke, and it never lifted. Even on the brightest mornings when the sun broke through the Irish clouds, the grounds of the mother and baby home seemed wrapped in a pale shroud. The building itself loomed like a scar upon the land, gray stone, pitted and damp, windows narrow as watchful eyes. The people of the town crossed themselves when they passed it, muttering prayers they did not mean, and they never lingered near its gates. Inside, the walls smelled of lime, soap, and something faintly sweet, an odor that clung to the air long after a child's cry had faded. Footsteps echoed like confessions forced upon unwilling tongues. The corridors were narrow, lined with doors that seemed to listen. Each creak of the hinges sounded like a warning. Each gust of wind whispered through the cracks like an unanswered plea. The women who entered were not called women anymore. They were stripped of their names and dressed in humility, gray as ash. Their bellies marked them as cursed, and their silence was demanded as penance. They were taught to bow their heads, to look upon the nuns as shepherds, though the shepherds' crooks were made of iron. Mother of God, forgive us, one girl would whisper in the dormitory at night, her hands pressed against the swell of her stomach. Her voice trembled thin as a reed in the wind, but the reply was not forgiveness. It was the rasp of another voice, older, dry, hollow. Forgive? There is no forgiveness here. The other mothers stirred but did not speak. They knew that the voice came from nowhere, and yet from everywhere at once. Some said it was the sound of their own shame echoing back. Others said it was the home itself, alive, feeding upon their despair. The children born in Tuam were branded before their first breath. Bastards, illegitimate, offspring of sin. They were baptized quickly, almost violently, as if the water itself might burn away the stain of their existence. Their tiny mouths opened in cries, but their voices were treated not as songs of life, but as reminders of sin that must be silenced. And so silence became the first law of the home. Silence in the dormitories, silence in the nursery, silence in the graveyard beneath the ground. But silence is never empty. Silence has weight. And within Tuam, silence had a voice. At night, when the lamps guttered and shadows stretched long against the walls, the mothers swore they heard the children calling from places they should not. Whispers seeped through the stone, muffled like breaths through soil. One girl, Mare, swore she felt a hand, cold and wet, clutch her wrist as she slept. She woke screaming, clawing at her arm, and found no hand, no water, only bruises blooming like violets under her skin. The nuns said she was hysterical. The other girls said nothing. But they all began to sleep with their hands hidden beneath their bellies, as if protecting both themselves and the unborn from fingers that clawed upward from beneath the floor. There was one corridor the women avoided, the oldest one, narrow and dark, leading to the unused wing. The plaster peeled there, revealing stone that seemed damp with breath. No one had been allowed to walk it for years, but sometimes, when the wind pressed hard against the windows, the mothers swore they heard footsteps in that passage. Soft, dragging as though small bare feet were pacing endlessly in the dark. Children, one nun whispered once, not knowing she was overheard. They never left us. They never leave. The women told themselves it was nonsense, the mutterings of tired minds, yet the dread seeped into them like damp through cloth. They prayed more fervently, not for forgiveness, but for the cries to cease. Still the cries came. Still the footsteps moved. Still the walls seemed to breathe. And then came the night when the cries did not sound like newborns at all. They were older, stronger, bitter. Mather, they whispered. Mother. The words slid down the corridors like a blade, cutting into every sleeping woman's heart. Some woke with wet faces, their arms outstretched, reaching for children they would never hold. Others stuffed cloth into their ears, but the word still found its way in, dripping like water through stone. Mather. Mather. The nuns grew sterner in those days. They carried their rosaries like whips. They hissed that temptation was testing them. They warned that the devil walked among the girls in the night, whispering lies to drag them further into sin. But the devil they named did not feel distant. He did not feel imagined. He felt close, too close. He felt like the very stones of Tuam. The building pressed in on them, each wall a confession box, each corridor a tomb. The mothers began to fear not only for their living children, but for their own sanity. For the whispers no longer came only at night. They began to hear them by day. In the nursery, in the laundry, in the chapel as the priest raised the host and the bells tolled, the women swore the ringing carried voices beneath it. The voices of children, crying, calling, accusing, and though no nun admitted it, their eyes betrayed them. When the mothers screamed or shivered, the sisters' gazes would dart, not to the women but to the walls, as if they too heard something moving in the stone. One night a storm lashed against the home, rain streaking like black tears against the glass. Lightning lit the dormitory, and for a breathless moment the mothers saw shapes upon the ceiling. Tiny shapes, dozens of them. Little hands reaching down from the plaster as if it were soft clay. Little mouths opening in screams they could not hear. When the light faded, the ceiling was bare. But the bruises that appeared on Mare's wrist returned, this time on all of them. Each mother bore the mark of small fingers pressed hard into their flesh. They wept, some in terror, some in longing. The nuns locked the doors. The storm passed, but the sound of it remained, echoing in the corridors like infants crying from inside the walls. And the women knew, though no one spoke it aloud, Tuam had become a womb of stone. A womb that never birthed, a womb that swallowed, and in the silence that followed a single word rose again, low, crawling, cold, sliding through the dormitory like breath on the back of the neck. Mather. The women turned, trembling, toward the dark corridor they had been told never to walk. The sound was coming closer. Behind the linen habits, the nuns carried secrets colder than confession. Their prayers were whispers sharpened into knives, each Ave Maria sealing another mouth shut. The habits rustled like shrouds when they passed through the corridors, their faces pale, veiled in linen, eyes downcast, yet sharp as glass when they lifted them. The mothers said the sisters moved like shadows carved from ice, never hurried, never hesitant, their steps perfectly measured as though the stones themselves bent to their rhythm. Every hallway trembled beneath their presence. The ringing of their rosaries was not the music of salvation, but of chains dragged across a floor unseen. Their lips, pale and cracked from endless prayers, whispered litanies that stung like salt upon a wound. Ave Maria, Gracia Plena. Their voices wove together, cold and exact, until the words felt less like worship and more like incantation. Each syllable pressed the mothers deeper into silence, as though their throats were bound by invisible cords. The nuns' eyes followed them constantly, even when they bowed, even when they prayed. One could feel the weight of their gaze even with eyes shut tight. It was said that no secret escaped them, no sin remained hidden, not because God revealed it, but because the nuns themselves collected them. It was Mare who whispered it first in the dormitory, her voice thin, trembling. They take our sins and wear them like veils. The others hushed her, fearing the walls might carry the words to listening ears. But she pressed on, eyes wild with sleeplessness. Every secret, every shame, they gather them, stitch them into their habits. That is why the cloth is so heavy. That is why the veils drag the ground. And though the others scoffed, they could not help but notice. When the sisters moved, their veils did not sway as cloth should. They hung low, heavy, as though soaked with something unseen. The sisters' cruelty was quiet, never loud, never breaking the surface of their composure. A slap delivered without expression, a child's wail answered with a single cutting glance. A mother forced to her knees until her bones cracked on the stone floor, while the nuns murmured prayers over her bent back, as if sanctifying her suffering, and yet, it was not these punishments that haunted the mothers most. It was the way the nuns prayed at night. When the women lay restless in their beds, they heard it. Low murmurs rising from the chapel, winding through the corridors like smoke. Not the solemn rhythm of Mass, but something harsher, hungrier. Latin words twisted until they no longer felt holy, but sharp, jagged as though the sisters were carving with them. Some nights, a single voice would rise above the rest. Not soft, not human, something guttural, scraped from a throat that had forgotten the shape of mercy. The sound clawed into the mother's sleep, and many woke with blood on their lips from biting down upon their own tongues. One night, Nuala, one of the youngest, crept from her bed to follow the sound. The others begged her not to. "You'll see what is not meant to be seen," one warned. But Nuala's eyes burned with a desperate need. "I want to know if they pray for us or against us," she whispered. She did not return until morning. Her hair was damp with sweat, her eyes glassy, her lips cracked. She lay silent all day, not answering questions, her hands trembling as though she held something unseen. That night, when she finally spoke, her words chilled the others to marrow. "They were not praying to him," she said. "They were praying to the ones beneath." She would not say more. She never spoke again without shaking. The women began to notice strange marks upon the sisters' hands. Red, raw indentations like rope burns circling their wrists, as though they bound themselves in secret. Some bore bruises upon their arms in shapes like fingers, though who or what had grasped them no one dared ask. And their eyes, oh, their eyes, in daylight pale and hollow. But at night, when a candle flame caught them, the women swore they reflected not firelight but something wet, black, gleaming, eyes that did not blink, eyes that did not forgive. Rumors spread like rot in the silence, that the nuns confessed not to priests but to the walls themselves, that their habits were never washed, for to cleanse them would release the weight of the sins they carried, that beneath the white veils their hair had fallen out, leaving scalps scarred and bloodless from too many whispered penances. The mothers clutched their bellies, their crosses, their prayers. But the prayers felt wrong in their mouths, as though the air itself rejected them. And then came the night of the storm. The mothers huddled in their dormitory, the rain clawing at the windows, the wind shrieking like 1,000 mouths. From the chapel came the sisters' chant, louder than ever, rising against the storm. Their voices clashed with thunder, yet the thunder seemed to bend around them, yielding to their rhythm. Suddenly, silence. The chant ceased. The storm held its breath. Then came a single knock upon the dormitory door. Slow, hollow, deliberate. None of the mothers moved. Their breaths froze in their throats. The knock came again. A voice soft, muffled by linen, whispered through the wood. "Open, children. Open and confess." The youngest girl, trembling, rose and stepped toward the door. The others tried to pull her back, but her eyes were glassy, as if something beyond herself guided her. Her hand reached for the latch, the door creaked open. No sister stood there, only a veil, white and heavy, lying upon the threshold as though it had been dropped. The fabric glistened in the stormlight, wet, dripping, not with rain, but with something thicker. The girl bent to pick it up, and from within the folds, a whisper slid into the room, colder than ice, sharper than any knife. "Your sins are mine," the mother screamed, slamming the door. But the veil remained on the floor, pulsing faintly, as though it were breathing. And in the silence that followed, the chapel bells rang of their own accord, 3 times hollow, mournful, calling the women toward something far darker than prayer. Tiny ribs protruded like rosary beads counted too long in silence. Milk was denied, bread withheld, water soured. And the children learned that starvation was their first sacrament. The hunger came first as a gnawing, a restless emptiness in the belly that could be endured. Then it grew sharper, a needle scratching at the bones. Soon it was no longer emptiness at all, but a presence, something alive, something watching, something that whispered from within the hollow places of the body. In Tuam, hunger was a prayer. It was taught, imposed, and sanctified. The sisters said it cleansed sin, carved obedience, stripped away the flesh so that only the soul might remain. And the children, small, pale, eyes too large for their faces, were baptized into this hunger long before they could walk. The nursery smelled not of milk, nor of warmth but of damp straw and sour cloth. The cradles were lined in rags, stiff with old stains, and the air was always cold, even in summer. When the children cried, their voices carried like bells cracked down the middle, thin, jagged, ringing with no comfort returned. The women, their mothers, longed to hold them. But their arms were kept empty. They were permitted glimpses, nothing more. A passing shadow of a child swaddled in gray cloth, carried by a nun whose eyes were sharper than scissors. "Love is a sin here," one mother whispered in the dormitory. "Love is indulgence." The others turned their faces to the wall because the truth of it was too heavy to bear. The hunger shaped the children's bodies into shrines of suffering. Their bellies swelled grotesquely while their limbs grew thin as twigs. Each rib could be counted as though marking decades of a rosary. Their lips cracked, their tongues dried, and their eyes became mirrors, reflecting not life but something hollow, something already half gone. And still the nuns spoke of penance. Still they spoke of God's mercy. Still they whispered, "Suffer the little children." But the children were not suffering alone. There were nights when the mothers swore the hunger itself prowled the halls. They heard footsteps where no one walked, dragging slow as though carrying a body too frail to stand. They smelled bread baking, though no bread was ever served, and the scent twisted their stomachs, made them weep. One night Sorsha woke to find a child standing in the dormitory door. Not her child, nor any she had birthed, but one whose eyes were vast and black, whose ribs pressed against the skin like bars of a cage. The child opened its mouth, but no cry came, only the sound of wind, cold and dry, rasping through a hollow chamber. She screamed, and the figure vanished into the corridor. But in the morning, beneath her bed lay a crust of bread as black as stone, damp with something that smelled of earth. The nuns kept records, ledgers inked in careful script, each line a name, each name followed by a single word, dead. The pages filled quickly. The ink dried faster than the bodies were buried, but there were other records, ones not written in ink. Scratches upon the walls of the nursery, tiny grooves made by fingernails too small to have strength, marks near the cradles, near the door, near the windows barred shut. When the wind blew, the scratches seemed to whisper. When the lamps guttered, the grooves deepened. And the mothers feared that the walls were keeping their own tally of the children swallowed by hunger. The sisters often reminded the women that fasting was holy, that hunger purified, that in their emptiness they might draw closer to God. But the mothers began to wonder, closer to which God? Because the hunger no longer felt empty, it felt filled. It felt like something lived inside it. One woman, Alice, whispered of a dream that would not leave her. "I saw them," she murmured in the dark. "The children, not as they were, but as they are now." Her voice cracked as though each word cut her throat. They were not thin. They were swollen with shadows. Their mouths were full of teeth not their own. And they were singing, not hymns, but something deeper, something that crawled under my skin. The others begged her to stop. But Alice's eyes rolled white, and she whispered as though the words came not from her but through her. "They do not hunger anymore. It is we who hunger for them." The hunger spread like rot in silence. The women wasted. The children withered. And still the walls grew fat with whispers, with scratching, with echoes of voices that should have been buried in earth. And then came the morning when the mothers awoke to a sound no one could name. Not crying. Not singing. But something between. The nursery was locked. The sisters forbade them to approach. But through the walls the women heard it. Dozens of voices, thin, brittle, yet steady. They were reciting prayers. Latin prayers. The voices of children speaking words they could not know. The sound went on until the bells rang for morning mass. Then silence. Thick as a shroud fell again. That night, a mother crept into the corridor outside the nursery. She pressed her ear to the door, trembling. At first she heard nothing. Then softly, faintly, the sound of chewing. Small mouths gnawing. Something wet. Something steady. And then a whisper, high and thin, slid through the wood, curling into her ear like smoke. "Mather, we are fed." Her body went cold. She stumbled back, choking on a sob. In the morning she was gone. The sisters told the others she had fled. But the mothers knew. Her name was scratched into the wall outside the nursery, carved by hands far too small to hold a blade. The hunger had become more than deprivation. It had become ritual. It had become baptism, and the children, baptized in emptiness, were learning to feast upon something else. In the dormitory, as the women tried to sleep, the sound returned, the faint gnawing, the brittle chewing. They pressed their hands to their ears, but it seeped through, steady, endless. And when lightning split the sky, they saw the shadows upon the ceiling, tiny ribs rising and falling, hundreds of them, as though the very air was alive with the starving dead. The storm swallowed the light, leaving only blackness, and in that blackness a single voice whispered from the nursery door, colder than the grave, "Your turn." Night carried the cries that daylight buried, and when the wailing stopped, the silence grew heavier than stone. The walls themselves began to hum with lullabies no mother ever sang. Darkness in Tuam was never still. It breathed. It listened. It remembered. When the lamps were snuffed, the building seemed to shift upon its foundations. The corridors stretched longer. The ceilings lower, the air colder, as though the house itself was growing closer to those trapped within. The mothers lay awake in their narrow beds. Every creak of the timber, every groan of the walls a threat. They prayed for silence, but silence was no mercy here. For when the children's cries ceased, something else began. It started as a hum, so faint it might have been mistaken for the wind. A low vibration curling through the stone, resonating in the iron frames of the beds. Then came the rise of sound, delicate and persistent. A tune without words, without comfort. A lullaby, but no mother had sung it. No sister had taught it. It rose from the walls themselves, from the cracks in the plaster, from the floorboards swollen with damp. The women clutched their crosses. Their lips moved, but no prayer could cover that tune. It wove into their bones, pressed against their hearts, pulling them toward sleep that felt too deep, too final. One night, Nuala whispered in the dark, "Do you hear them?" Her voice trembled. "Their bones are singing." The others shushed her, afraid the sisters would hear. Yet in the silence that followed, the lullaby swelled, rising like a tide. The notes were thin, brittle, as though sung through teeth instead of lips. And then, clearer, closer, a wordless hum that circled the dormitory, moving from bed to bed. Mare pressed her hands over her ears until her nails cut her skin, but still the lullaby reached her. It burrowed through flesh, straight into marrow. The mothers began to dream the same dream. A field of white stones, small and countless, spread beneath a sky without stars. Between the stones, tiny shapes moved. Infant bones, fragile and pale, crawling upon the earth. They rocked themselves in invisible cradles, skulls tilting side to side, their empty mouths opening in song. The women woke with screams lodged in their throats. Their arms ached as if they had been holding children all night, though their beds remained empty. And still the lullabies returned. Some said it was the dead children. Others said it was the living, those who had starved until their voices cracked and sank into the walls. But the oldest whispered something else, something that made even the bravest avert their eyes. The walls have learned the sound of hunger, and now they sing it back. One evening during Vespers, the mothers sat in the chapel as the nuns chanted. The air was thick with incense, suffocating, metallic. And beneath the voices of the sisters, another melody wound its way upward, soft at first, then sharper, cutting through the holy hymn. The women froze. Their eyes darted. The nuns continued as though they heard nothing. But the lullaby climbed higher, filling the rafters, echoing in the beams until the entire chapel trembled with the sound of unseen children singing. Then the crucifix above the altar cracked. The figure of Christ tilted forward, splintering the wood, and the lullaby stopped. The silence that followed was worse. That night, Sorcia swore she heard her own child's voice among the singing. She rose from her bed, guided by the tune, her feet moving of their own accord. The others tried to hold her back, but her body was stronger than her will. She slipped into the corridor, humming with the walls vanishing into the dark. The next morning, her bed was empty. The sisters said she had been taken away, relocated for her improvement. But beneath her pillow lay a rattle of bone, small as a sparrow's, still warm to the touch. After that, no one dared speak of the lullabies aloud, but they all heard them. In the dormitory, in the nursery, in the laundry where water sloshed without hands. Even in their own hearts, beating in time with the rhythm. Then came the storm. The rain lashed the windows, the wind keened through the cracks. The lullabies grew louder, more insistent, drowning out even the thunder. The women clung to each other, teeth chattering, their eyes wide with terror. And then, as lightning split the sky, they saw it. The walls bulged. The plaster swelled, cracking as though something pressed outward from within. Tiny shapes, fingers, ribs, skulls, pushed against the stone, straining to emerge. Their mouths gaped in silent cries, but their song filled the air, a choir of the forgotten. The women shrieked, covering their eyes. Some fainted. Some clawed at the floor. When the lightning faded, the walls were smooth again. But the lullaby remained, stronger than ever. One mother, unable to bear it, pressed her ear to the wall. Her eyes widened. She began to sway. Her lips moved, repeating the lullaby note for note. The others pulled her back, but she resisted, her face slack, her voice rising in harmony with the unseen choir. "They're calling," she whispered. "They want us to sing with them." And before the women could silence her, she bent backward, her body stiff as a board. her throat open wide. From her mouth came not her own voice, but the shrill, brittle singing of dozens of children, layered, relentless, rising until the dormitory shook, the lamps shattered. The room plunged into black, and in that blackness the lullaby swelled into something new, something harsher, crueler, no longer a song but a command. It whispered, not sung. Come closer. Not all graves are dug with holy hands. Some are carved from filth, darkness, and rot. Beneath the ground of Tuam, baptismal waters turned to blackened wells of death. The earth in Tuam was never still. It shifted like a restless sleeper, uneasy with the burden pressed into its belly. Grass grew pale as though starved of sun, its roots curling away from the soil as if refusing to drink. And beneath it lay the chapel no priest would bless, no parishioner would enter, no psalm could redeem. The septic chamber, a place not meant for bodies, a place meant for waste, for what the world discards and forgets. Yet here the forgotten were laid to rest, not in coffins, not in consecrated ground, but in darkness that reeked of lime and decay. The nuns called it efficiency. The locals called it rumor. But the children knew it as the only chapel where their names would never be spoken. At night the air itself seemed to carry a rot-sweet stench, faint but clinging, as if the wind had memory. Those who lived nearby claimed they sometimes heard water beneath the soil, but it did not trickle. It gurgled, it choked, it moaned. And if you leaned too close, if you dared press your ear to the damp stones, you would hear more than water. You would hear the children. A nun once whispered in the laundry hall, her voice a rasp as if scraped raw, "Do not look down there at night." "Why?" asked another, half in jest. The older nun's face tightened, her lips cracked from prayer and silence. "Because the darkness speaks back." The younger one laughed, but her laughter faltered when the candles flickered, though no draught stirred. They were not buried in shrouds. They were not given last rites. They were tossed, limp bodies, tiny and frail, slipped into the pit as though into a drain. The sound of them falling was swallowed quickly, a soft splash, a dull thud, the silence after. Those who dropped them down never stayed long. They fled, clutching their rosaries as though the beads could bind their guilt. And yet they always felt a tug in the night, as if unseen fingers wound around their ankles, dragging them back toward that septic chapel. Years later, when storms broke across Tuam, thunder shaking the heavens, villagers swore the ground hissed. As rain poured, the earth bubbled, spat, and wept dark water into the ditches. Not clear water, not holy water, black, thick, foul, sliding like tar. And in its gleam, some swore they saw eyes. The septic chapel had no altar, but the walls were slick with offerings. Lime dust clung to them in patches like pale ashen veils. The bones beneath it did not rest. They stacked, they shifted, they pressed against one another as if trying to climb free. In silence, in darkness, they assembled their own congregation, and the silence did not remain silence. It grew teeth. It hummed, it rattled. It sang a hymn no choir ever dared, of it, soft, guttural, wet. The sound of prayer dragged through soil and sewage. A man once stumbled drunk past the grounds. He told the tavern, voice shaking, that he had seen pale fingers pressing up through the weeds. Like roots, he stammered, but moving, grasping. The others laughed, slapped his back, bought him another pint. But the next morning, his boots were found by the wall of the home. Boots, but no man, only prints in the mud that stopped suddenly at the drain. The septic chapel was a grave of denial. But denial cannot bind forever. The ground shifted. The earth cracked. The water rose. And through the cracks, whispers began to seep. At first, only children heard them. Cries in the night, songs without melody, and sometimes laughter. Laughter that made their blood run cold. One girl, her hair cropped short by punishment, pressed her ear to the stone at the edge of the drain. She wanted to know if the others, the ones who vanished, were still below. Her breath caught when she heard them. Not words, not prayers. Just the sound of tiny teeth clicking in the dark like rosary beads struck together. She pulled back, trembling. But it was too late. The sound followed her into her dreams, a clicking chorus, louder and louder, until it drowned even her own heartbeat. And when she woke, her pillow was damp, as though the chapel had leaked into her bed. The nuns told no one. They scrubbed, they salted, they prayed. But prayer, once sharpened into a weapon, can cut both ways. At night, when they knelt in their cells, they sometimes smelled it. The rot, the damp, the filth, and in the stillness a voice would rasp through the silence. Not erased, not erased, not erased. The septic chapel waits. The ground above it stirs. The black water rises, carrying secrets that no stone can contain. And if you stand there long enough, if you linger past midnight, you may hear it, the splash of something climbing. 796, a number whispered by wind across the grass. But no lips dared shape the names that should have followed. Numbers are safe. Numbers are bloodless. They can be written in ledgers etched on stone, whispered in sermons without trembling. But names carry weight. Names can haunt. Names can rise from the soil when called. The nuns knew this. That is why they counted but never christened. 796 children stripped of their cries, reduced to arithmetic. Not sons, not daughters, not lives. Just the tally of the erased, and still the earth remembered. When dusk fell over Tuam, shadows stretched long across the grass. In that hour, when light bent and dark swelled, villagers swore the number hung in the air. 796. It was not spoken aloud, yet it pressed against the ear, soft as breath, heavy as guilt. Some said the number lingered in the toll of bells, each strike another phantom child. Others claimed it pulsed in the rhythm of the rain, as though heaven itself wept in sequence. But the cruelest whispers said that, if one stood by the broken wall of the home at midnight, the ground itself would count. Soft thuds beneath the soil like knuckles rapping on wood one after another, until the count reached 796. And then silence. The silence of a ledger closed. The silence of a door locked. The silence of children who had no graves of their own. Why not give them markers? A young novice once dared ask. The Mother Superior's voice was cold, a knife dipped in scripture. Markers invite memory. Memory invites sin. The girl pressed her lips shut, but at night she wept quietly into her pillow. For even in the dark, she swore she heard little voices whispering numbers back to her, over and over, until her dreams filled with faceless mouths. The registry books were thin, the handwriting neat. Each line stripped down to essentials: date, gender, cause of death. No cradle songs, no stories, no touch of a mother's hand. Just entries written in black ink, fading, smudged, skeletal. But sometimes when scholars or priests tried to read them decades later, ink bled across the page. Perfect lines blurred as though the names, those missing, forbidden names, tried to claw their way back. The numbers smeared into shapes that resembled letters, half born, half erased. It was said no archivist could ever read the ledgers alone. The pages shivered as though breathing, and the silence of the reading room thickened until it felt like unseen children gathered close, waiting to hear if they had been remembered. And still the nuns prayed. They prayed to cover the numbers. They prayed to drown the silence. But prayer too became corrupted. One winter's night, the chapel bell struck 7 times before its rope split. 7 and no more. The following evening it rang 9. The next 6, 7, 9, 6. The nuns went pale, clutching their beads so tight the wood splintered. One muttered, "Coincidence," but her voice trembled. Another whispered, "They are spelling themselves back into the world." Children of the town began playing a cruel game. They stood near the ruins, eyes closed, chanting, 796, 796, 796. And then they would stop, ears straining, hearts thudding, for sometimes a voice not their own would join in. A smaller voice, a thinner voice. From the earth beneath them, parents forbade them to go near, but children are drawn to places where silence promises secrets. And so the game was played again and again until the day one boy did not return. They found only his cap by the wall. His footprints ended in grass that looked freshly pressed from beneath, as though something had risen to swallow him whole. Numbers are safer than names. But numbers, when repeated, begin to beat like drums. 796. A dirge, a curse, a pulse that stitched itself into the soil of Tuam. And those who dared stand in that field swore the number did not stop at 796. It grew, 797, 798, as if the ground still had mouths to feed, as if the earth itself hungered to add to its tally. The number is not finished. It waits, it calls. It drags more into its ledger with no ink, no pen, only silence and dirt. And when the wind moves across the grass at Tuam, it does not rustle. It counts softly, endlessly. 1,000 children without faces. 1,000 names without lips. 796. 797. 790. The women stood outside the gates long after their bodies had been turned away. They waited with arms that ached, with throats that swallowed back cries, with eyes that burned holes into the stone walls. But Tuam did not open its doors for mothers. The world had called them fallen. Women who dared bring forth life without a ring, without a husband, without the blessing of the church. The nuns took their children and scoured their names from memory. To the villagers they became shadows, sin-embodied walking warnings. But shadows, when denied their light, grow long. And in Tuam they did not fade. They gathered at the gates in silence, their faces half hidden by scarves, their backs bent with shame, their fingers raw from labor. They did not plead. Pleading had been beaten from them. They simply waited. Waited for a door to open. Waited for a voice to call. Waited for arms to be filled again. No voice came. No arms were filled, but still they lingered. Villagers spoke of them in hushed tones. Women who stood by the walls even in rain, their skirts heavy with mud, their eyes fixed on windows where candlelight flickered. They did not move when spoken to. They did not blink when insulted. They only stood as though carved from grief, carved from stone. One farmer swore that on a fog-drowned morning he had passed the gates and counted 12 women. Their bodies were still, but their mouths moved, whispering soundless prayers. When he blinked, the road cleared. The gates were bare, yet the mud at his boots bore the imprint of many feet. "Do you think they see us?" one mother whispered to another, her lips trembling in the cold. The second, eyes hollow, murmured, "They do, but they pretend they don't. Will they give him back?" The first asked. The second's voice cracked like a bone. "No, they will give you silence." And silence became their vigil. The nuns forbade them from lingering, but every dismissal only summoned more. For every woman whose child was taken, another shadow pressed against the gates, and soon the gates seemed heavier, sagging on their hinges, as though the grief outside weighed more than the stone within. At night, travelers swore they saw pale outlines drifting across the fields. Not flesh, not mist, something in between. They floated toward the walls, hands outstretched, arms empty, always empty. The dogs of the village howled on those nights, scratching at doors, refusing to face the direction of Tuam. Inside the walls, the children cried for their mothers. The cries were muffled, choked, smothered in stern hymns and cold discipline. But sometimes, when the night was deep, the cries carried through cracks in the mortar. The women outside lifted their heads then, breath catching as though their names had been spoken. One whispered to the air, "Sean." "Is that you?" Another clutched her chest. "Mary, my heart. Mary, I hear you." They pressed their faces to the gates, desperate to catch one more note, one more breath. But the cries always faded, swallowed by stone and silence. And so they waited longer. As years passed, their vigil outlasted their bodies. Those who lived were bent, weathered, aged before their time. Those who died did not leave. Their shadows thickened. Their outlines lingered. Their presence clung to the gates, blacker than midnight. The children inside sometimes whispered of shapes they saw at night. Women with hollow eyes, reaching hands, lips moving in voiceless hymns. The nuns told them it was sin-given form. But the children knew they were mothers. Mothers who had not gone. One storm-racked night, when lightning tore the sky and rain lashed the windows, the sisters heard a sound at the gate. A slow, steady knocking. Not frantic, not loud. Just patient. Knock, knock, knock. They opened the shutter, lantern light spilling over the road, but no one was there. Still the knocking continued. Not on the gate, not on the wall, but inside their own ears, inside their skulls, echoing like a memory that refused to die. The Mother Superior pressed a crucifix to her lips, her knuckles white. "They want their names back," she whispered, though none had asked. The vigil grew heavier in the years that followed. No passerby could cross the road without feeling eyes on them. No villager could sleep without dreaming of empty cradles rocking in the wind. And sometimes, just sometimes, the shadows at the gate moved. They turned. They looked. and their mouths began to shape the names that had been stolen, syllables twisted, heavy, broken. The names crawled into the air like smoke, names that made the grass blacken where they fell, names that made the sky split with thunder, names that made the walls tremble as if they were about to crack open, and then silence. Always silence. But the vigil does not end. It waits still beyond time, beyond death. Empty arms stretch endlessly, hungry for voices swallowed too soon. And when you pass the old grounds of Tuam, you may see them. Shadows clinging to rusted gates, lips moving in prayer, eyes hollow but watching, waiting for a door to open, waiting for a voice to call, waiting for a child to answer. And if you listen too long, if you linger at the gate, you may feel a tug, not on your coat, not on your hand, but on your very name, as though someone long erased has mistaken it for their child's. No diary holds it, no priest records it, but the silence of the sisters was its own scripture written in omission and decay. Confession is meant to cleanse. But in Tuam, confession was locked behind teeth. What was spoken to priests was trimmed, softened, reshaped into obedience. What was never spoken lingered like mildew on stone, staining every breath inside those walls. The sisters carried it with them, not in journals, not in letters, not in words at all, but in the way their eyes darted when the wind howled through the drains, in the way their knuckles bled from prayer that never eased, in the way their voices cracked during hymns as though something else sang louder within them. Their silence was louder than any scream. There were whispers among the villagers that a secret scripture existed, not one bound in leather, not one kept in the church vaults, but one carved in absence, hidden in the pauses between chants, woven into the rhythms of daily ritual, each omission another line, each refusal another psalm. It was said that if you listened long enough during their prayers, you could hear the gaps. Gaps wide enough to fall into, gaps heavy enough to bury the living. Mother Mary, full of grace, but the voices faltered on the word grace, every time, like a chasm too wide to cross. One young novice once asked, trembling, "Why do we stumble there?" An older nun turned, her face gray as ash, and whispered back, "Because grace does not live here. No diary holds it. No record exists, yet the stone remembers. The walls stained with lime and shadow sweated in summer as though weeping. Visitors who placed their palms against them swore the stone was warm, as if pulsing with some buried heartbeat. And if you pressed your ear close enough, you could hear it. Not words, not prayers, but the weight of silence pressing back. There was one nun, old and withered, who carried her silence differently. Her lips moved constantly, but no sound came. It was said she had confessed once, truly confessed, and the words had been stolen from her throat. Since that day, she mouthed prayers without breath, her tongue heavy, her voice severed. The children called her the Silent Sister. The other nuns feared her, for even in the candle-lit chapel, shadows clung to her habit longer than they should have. At night, she would pace the halls barefoot, the slap of her steps echoing through the dormitories, and sometimes the orphans whispered. Her steps were accompanied by others, lighter, smaller, a chorus of bare feet trailing behind her in perfect rhythm. One evening, a storm clawed across Tuam, rattling windows, bending trees. The sisters gathered in the chapel to pray. Their chants rose, steady at first, but then fractured. Each word collapsed under its own weight until nothing remained but the crackle of rain and the groan of timbers. Then came the sound. Not thunder, not wind, a low murmur rising from the stone beneath them, like dozens of voices speaking at once, but without language, without form, a confession unspoken, spilling up from the septic chapel below, pressing against the soles of their feet. One sister cried out, clutching her ears, "They are telling us what we buried." But the Mother Superior struck her cheek, hissing, "No one speaks, not here, not ever," and the silence thickened, more binding than chains. It was not only storms that broke the sisters' silence. In the stillest hours of the night, when all should have slept, the walls themselves whispered. Cracks opened like mouths, the plaster crumbled like teeth, and in the darkness, words not written by human hand seemed to crawl across the stone. Shapes, names, numbers, not carved, not painted, but grown, as if the very mold etched scripture into the walls, forming the confessions the sisters had refused to speak. One novice, sleepless and curious, traced her finger along a word that bloomed black in the plaster. Her lips formed the letters. Her tongue gave them life. She did not rise from her bed again. In the morning, her eyes were open, her mouth gaping as if frozen mid-prayer. On her tongue was written one name, not hers. The sisters began sealing cracks with lime, painting walls over and over to smother the creeping words. But still, the scripture returned. Each morning the walls bore new lines, darker, deeper, more legible. And though none dared read them aloud, the silence of the convent deepened into dread. Because silence can only hold so much. Because every omission is a seed, and seeds grow. One night the silent sister walked into the chapel. Her bare feet left wet prints though the floors were dry. She moved to the altar and raised her hands, lips moving faster, wider, though no sound came. The other sisters awoke to the toll of the bell, though no one had pulled the rope. The bell cried once, twice, thrice, then stopped. In the silence that followed, a sound like ripping filled the chapel. Not cloth, not timber, but air itself tearing open. The silent sister's mouth gaped wide, wider, until darkness spilled forth, thick and formless. And within that darkness were words. Thousands of them. All the names denied, all the cries smothered, all the confessions silenced. They poured out of her throat, filling the chapel like smoke, filling the sisters' lungs until they could no longer breathe. And when it ended, when the darkness sank back into stone, the silent sister's body lay still, her mouth sealed shut as though stitched by invisible hands. The nuns carried her away. They told no one. They left no record. But the chapel smelled of ash for weeks, and the bell above never rang true again. Still, the silence continued, thicker, heavier, darker. The sisters walked like ghosts through their own halls, their lips trembling with the weight of words they would never speak, and the walls waited. The scripture of omission lengthened, names pressed harder, numbers bled through paint. The convent was filling with unspoken prayers, prayers that one day would demand to be heard. The first strike of the shovel did not sound like earth, it rang hollow, as if the ground itself wore armor of bone. The men froze, hands trembling on wooden handles, their breath quickening in the morning mist. The grave was not dug that day, it was unveiled. The spades clawed deeper, scraping against something harder than clay, more fragile than stone. A brittle chorus rose with every strike, the breaking cry of ancient marrow. The sound was not a sound at all, but a shiver, a vibration that crawled up their arms and settled in their skulls. It was as if the soil had learned to sing the hymns of the damned. The pit widened under their labor, but no single coffin emerged. Only fragments, only skulls pressed together like eggs in a nest that had long since soured tiny teeth, some still rooted in fractured jaws, spilled like rosary beads snapped and scattered on holy ground. A femur lay across a ribcage, not its own bones braided into bones, a congregation without order, a parish without priest or altar. No grave had been blessed here. This was a midden, a septic chalice, where innocence was poured out and left to rot in silence. The men whispered to one another, but their voices shook. Too many, God forgive us. This is not burial, their words faltered, swallowed by the pit, as though the grave itself drank confession like water. One bent to lift a skull, but the soil clung to it, reluctant to release. When it broke free, a ragged tuft of hair remained matted to its crown, a crown of filth and time. The laborer dropped it at once, and it rolled, jaw yawning open, as though it had waited decades for air to rush back into its throat. Another voice broke. Don't look at their faces, but every hollow socket looked back. The townsfolk gathered at the edges, drawn by the scent of upturned earth, by the rumors that spread like fever. Mothers covered their mouths, eyes wide with a horror they did not dare name. Fathers pressed caps low, unwilling to meet one another's gaze, and among them, the old whispered, they said the children never left. They said the sisters kept their ledger clean. But their hands, the ground remembers more than paper ever could. The excavation deepened, and with it the air thickened. It smelled not of fresh dirt, but of stagnant wells and something older, sweet, cloying, like decay made syrup. The sun above dimmed as if cloaked by invisible veils, though no clouds crossed the sky. Even the birds that had circled the grounds in years past refused. Now to wheel overhead, what was being unearthed was not merely bone, it was memory made fleshless, it was silence given. Form the pit gaped like a wound widening still. One man, braver or more cursed than the rest, spoke as his spade lifted another child's ribcage from the muck. he muttered, voice nearly broken. "They're too small, all of them." And as he spoke, something shifted in the earth beneath him. Not stone, not wood, but a hollow, a cavity deeper still. The ground gave way with a moan like breath drawn through rotten reeds. The man tumbled forward. Lantern crashing beside him, its light revealed what lay below. Not one chamber, but many, a honeycomb of dark hollows, walls lined with bones stacked like bricks. Tiny limbs arranged as if some unseen architect had built a cathedral of the forsaken. The lantern's flame guttered, shadows lurching along the walls in their flicker. The bones seemed to stir, to reach, to cradle the intruder in a parody of motherly embrace. The others hauled him up with ropes. But his face had changed, his eyes had gone wide, pupils swallowed whole. As if he had seen something deeper than earth itself, he whispered, lips pale. "They're still down there, still watching, still waiting." Night closed its hand over Tuam, and yet the men worked on, compelled not by duty but by dread, by the certainty that if they left the pit open and unguarded, something might crawl out. Every spade, every pull of earth, was another heartbeat in the dark litany of the excavation. And then, a child's hum drifted from the pit soft. Tuneless, neither song nor moan, it seeped upward like steam. Curling into the ears of the living, some turned and fled. Swearing they felt small hands tugging at their clothes, their hair, others froze, entranced. Heads tilting as though lulled into sleep by a cradle song older than their own birth. The excavation did not close the wound. It only deepened it. And what it uncovered could not be buried again. When dawn came, the pit lay open, filled not with bones alone, but with silence so heavy it smothered every breath. The townsfolk swore they saw movement, tiny shadows flickering between the ribs. Between the skulls, some swore they heard the earth whisper numbers in their ears. A roll call of the nameless, each digit another toll of a church bell that had not rung in decades. And at the pit's edge, one spade stood upright in the soil, though no man had left it there. Its handle quivered, as if gripped by invisible hands, as if the ground itself was not finished speaking. The grave was open now, and the dead had remembered how to count. The night after the pit was opened, the air thickened as though the world itself had drawn a long, ragged breath it could not release. Tuam lay still. But the stillness was not peace, it was the hush before storm, the silence of a church whose altar had been overturned. And then the voices began. They did not arrive as screams, nor as cries of pain. They came soft like threads unraveling in the dark at first. One could mistake them for wind slipping through hedgerows, or cattle stirring in distant fields. But soon it was clear. These were not sounds of earth or beast. These were syllables, words nearly formed, murmurs swollen with hunger, children's voices, faint yet sharp, humming in fractured tones that slid between lullaby and lament. And from the pit, where the bones had been disturbed, the voices multiplied. In every cottage, sleepers woke mothers clutched their rosaries tighter, whispering the Ave Maria under trembling breath. But the beads slipped in their hands as if oiled, as if the prayers themselves no longer wished to be spoken. Fathers pressed palms to shuttered windows, eyes straining into the night, but no form crossed the lanes. Only the sound moved, circling, weaving, as though the town itself were caught in a cradle rocked by unseen hands at the chapel, its doors barred and its bell rusted into silence. The sisters gathered in the corridor with pale candles that guttered low. Their lips did not move, but their eyes darted, wide and shining, for they, more than anyone, knew the voices that rose. They knew the cadence, the rhythms, the half-formed syllables. They had heard them once in life, when those mouths had begged for bread, for water, for mercy denied. One novice pressed her back against the wall, shaking her head violently. "No, no, don't listen." Her whisper cracked into silence as her candle extinguished, snuffed not by air but by breath that was not her own. The voices swelled, not in one place but everywhere at once. They gathered in the rafters of barns, in the black water of the well, in the hollow of shoes left at doorways, 1,000 mouths opening without flesh, 1,000 throats singing without air. It was not a hymn. It was an indictment, and the words, once shapeless, began to shape themselves. You left us, you buried us, you forgot us. The men who had dug the pit heard them loudest. They swore later that every syllable pierced straight into their marrow, vibrating their bones like struck glass. One man covered his ears until blood leaked from beneath his palms, yet the song remained inside his skull, echoing where no silence could reach. Another fell to his knees, crying into the dirt, I only dug, I only dug. The ground replied with laughter, brittle as snapping twigs at the town's edge. Old women lit lamps in their windows and spoke low. Steady words to drive the voices back, but flame bent sideways as though drawn toward the pit, and their words faltered as unseen lips whispered over theirs, mocking, repeating each line in tones that grew colder, thinner, sharper. One lamp shattered, its glass spraying like ice. The woman within swore she saw a child's shadow pressed against her wall, head tilted, mouth moving though no breath stirred the room by midnight. Tuam itself was a choir, every stone, every gate. Every plank of wood hummed with resonance, even the river seemed to carry the voices, rippling not with water but with syllables, and above it all, the pit groaned as if the soil itself were now a throat, straining to release all it had swallowed. A witness claimed that if one stood at the grave's lip and closed his eyes, the voices gathered into one, not many but one. A great, formless, endless voice, a voice so vast it seemed the sky itself had been hollowed to contain it. It said nothing of forgiveness. It said nothing of peace. It sang only of memory, sharpened into blade. Of hunger fermented into wrath. The sisters clung to their chapel walls, and at last one elder spoke, her voice raw, breaking through years of practiced silence. They are not praying. She lowered her candle, eyes glinting in the dim. They are judging. No one replied. For even the stones seemed to listen, as dawn bled over the horizon. The voices did not fade, they shifted from rage to something colder, from chant to something slower. The townsfolk, gaunt with sleeplessness, staggered to their doors and found the world coated in stillness as heavy as frost. But when they looked back toward the pit, they saw what no earth should reveal. The bones had risen in patterns, stacked and ordered by hands unseen, skulls in rows like a congregation, ribs bent into arches, forming a grotesque cathedral, and in the center, a hollow space where silence pooled thick as blood. The choir was not gone. It was only waiting for the living to join that night. More than one villager swore they heard their own names sung among the dead, and some swore they saw, at the pit's edge, the faint shimmer of children standing shoulder to shoulder, mouths open in soundless cry, eyes burning with judgment too long withheld. The choir had risen, and Tuam would never again sleep in peace.